Okay, so we're going to be looking at the brain models. Now, there's going to be a number of different views of the brain models and several different models as well. So I'll be kind of switching things in and out as I'm talking about the different regions and areas of the brain. So we'll start here with activity 2 on your lab sheet, regions of the brain. So first we're going to be talking about the cerebrum. Now the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. When you think of a brain, that's mostly what you're thinking of. It's this convoluted area, it's big, and it's where most of the higher brain functions are taking place. So the cerebral hemispheres are the right and the left hemispheres, of course. So here is the right hemisphere, here's the left hemisphere. Those are divided by what we call the longitudinal fissure. Remember, a fissure is a gap. And so you can see that right here, the longitudinal fissure. The cerebrum has what we call the cerebral cortex. Now remember, any organ that's a solid organ has an outer layer that's called the cortex, and it has an inner layer that's called the medulla. So the cerebral cortex is all of this outer layer of the cerebrum. And you see a couple of features here, what we call gyri, or one would be a gyrus, and sulci, one would be a sulcus. So the gyri are the raised ridges. Any of these raised ridges that you see on the cerebral cortex are gyri. One would be a gyrus. The sulci, just like in the spinal cord, are just indentations, okay, which appear to be lines basically. So you see here, you see some here, and here. It's kind of like which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, sulci or gyri? Okay. Now, I'm going to swap this brain model out, and I'm going to put a different brain model in, because now we're going to look at some specific, sorry about the sound, a specific sulcus and some very specific gyri. Okay, so this is what we call the colored brain model. I'll be pointing a bunch of things out on this, but in particular, I want you to concentrate on this red gyrus and this blue gyrus. This is the anterior part of the brain, and this is the posterior part of the brain. So this very prominent sulcus that you see running right down between the red and the blue gyrus is what we call the central sulcus. That's a really important landmark. It divides the brain into the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, but more importantly, it highlights these two particular gyri here. So central sulcus. Because this gyrus is in front of it, this is called the precentral gyrus. And this one behind it is called the postcentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is your primary motor cortex. Most of your motor commands that come from the brain and go to your muscles come from this particular gyrus. So again, it's the precentral gyrus. It's your primary motor cortex. The gyrus in blue is your postcentral gyrus behind the central sulcus. And this is your primary sensory cortex. In other words, most of your sensory information that comes from your muscles and so forth goes to this particular gyrus in your brain. You obviously have these in both hemispheres, okay? So again, central sulcus, precentral gyrus, primary motor cortex, postcentral gyrus, primary sensory cortex, okay? There is a parietal occipital gyrus that you shouldn't need to worry about too much, okay, back here. And then there's a lateral gyrus that divides out the temporal lobe right here. I'm sorry, sulcus. These are sulci, okay? Now let's talk about the lobes. Since we've got this model here and the lobes are in different colors, it's easy to talk about the lobes of the brain. So you've got the frontal lobe here. You've got the parietal lobe here. You've got the occipital lobe back here. And you've got the temporal lobe right here. You should be able to name some general functions of each of these lobes. So frontal lobe, this is where all of your higher mentation takes place. So in particular, things like decision making, social and moral behavior, reasoning, some of your higher cognitive functions are from the frontal lobe, as well as, of course, your primary motor cortex. The parietal lobe is primarily responsible for processing sensory information. The occipital lobe is where your primary visual cortex is. In other words, all of your visual information is processed here. And your temporal lobe here is hearing, also some memory, okay? And now your sheet mentions the limbic lobes, but we're going to be looking at a different lobe called the insula. Okay, and I'm going to show that to you in a little while when I look at a different model. Okay, what's really interesting is the frontal lobe is actually the last lobe of the brain to mature, okay, which, again, reasoning, decision making, okay. That's one of the reasons why teenagers don't necessarily make great decisions. This lobe literally doesn't mature until about the age of 25, all right? Okay, now we're going to switch this out and we're going to look at what's called the sagittal view of the brain. Okay, so a sagittal cut would cut the brain into right and left halves. So here we have the sagittal view of the brain. All right. The reason we're looking at the sagittal view is because there's some structures internally here that you have to know. So this is the corpus callosum. Okay. If you hold it sideways like that, it kind of looks like the letter C. Okay, corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a tract of white matter, okay, which means it's myelinated, right? And this is the structure that connects both the right and the left hemispheres. In other words, this structure allows the right and the left hemispheres to communicate with each other. Okay. The olfactory bulbs are best seen, well, you can see them in the sagittal view. Okay, I guess I'll turn it this way. Now you can only see one of them here. So this is the olfactory bulb right here. That's one olfactory bulb. You have two of them. You have one in each hemisphere. This is cranial nerve number 1, and this is responsible for your sense of smell, okay, olfactory. Okay. If I just switch this out for a second and I take an entire brain, put it here so that you can see it. Now you can see both of these olfactory bulbs right here and right here. Now while I've got this brain here, I'm going to actually point out a couple of other things, okay? Right here is the pituitary gland. Remember, the pituitary gland hangs in the sella turcica? Okay, so it's hanging down by a stalk that you can kind of see if you look carefully, right in there, called the infundibulum. And one of the other things that you can see on this view when we're looking at the base of the brain is what they call the optic chiasm. So the word chiasm means like an X, and I'm going to push this pituitary gland down a little bit, and you're going to be able to see this structure right here. You see a Roman numeral 2 on it that is shaped like an X. Okay, that's because these are the optic nerves, which are cranial nerves number 2. Okay, and it's shaped like an X, so it's the optic chiasm. Part of the information from the right eye is going to go around to the left, and part of the information from the left eye is going to go around to the right. Okay, and when we talk about vision, I'll talk a little more about that. All right. So again, olfactory bulbs, optic chiasm, here's the pituitary gland. Now, let's move on to the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is the very center of the brain. Okay, it's a small area, but it does a lot of important things. So again, we're looking at our sagittal view, and the diencephalon is basically located right here. Okay. Now remember when we talked about the ventricles in the ventricle model video? Okay, the third ventricle was right in the center of the brain. And just to orient you, the third ventricle is going to be located right here. All right. And the epithalamus is the roof of the third ventricle, which is located right there. The pineal gland is a little tiny gland. It's actually part of the endocrine system, but we'll point it out here because you can see it. It's located right there. It's a little tiny gland. This is the gland that makes melatonin. All right, that's the hormone that makes you go to sleep. And it also is more active, the pineal gland, when you're young. It sets what's called your circadian rhythms. Your circadian rhythms are, basically whether you're a night person or a day person. Okay. Now there's two structures that make up the diencephalon. Di means two, encephalon means brain. So we have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, in a sagittal view of the brain, you're really just looking at kind of a one-dimensional view of these structures. These are three-dimensional structures that are deep in the brain. If you look in your lab book, there's some good pictures of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. But just to point them out here on the sagittal view, this raised area right here represents the thalamus. Now remember, the thalamus itself is actually two egg-shaped structures in the center of the brain. Okay, the thalamus is the relay station for all of your sensory information. So in other words, any sensory information that comes into your brain, it goes to your thalamus first. So that's any sensations from receptors throughout the body. That's any of your special senses. Hearing, vision, taste. They believe that smell does not actually get processed through the thalamus. That's the only one that doesn't go through the thalamus. So again, the thalamus is the relay station for sensory information. This little dot in the middle is what's referred to here as the intermediate mass. It's actually the connection between your right and your left thalamus. Okay. Now the hypothalamus, hypo below, right, is this area of the brain right here. Okay. Now what you don't see on this particular model is the pituitary gland, which would be hanging down right here. So here's the hypothalamus. Okay. The hypothalamus is responsible for a whole bunch of functions. So thirst, hunger, emotions. It regulates your autonomic functions. It produces some hormones. Okay. It's connected by the infundibulum to the pituitary gland, which again is your master gland. So this little tiny part of the brain really has lots and lots of different functions that it does. I'll also point out right here, which is the mammillary bodies. Okay. Again, you can kind of see one half of the optic chiasm if you look at it this way. There's the olfactory bulb. There's the optic chiasm right there. Okay. Now moving down into the brain stem, if again we look at the sagittal view here, this section right here is the brain stem. So the generalized function of the brain stem is basically it regulates all your vital functions that keep you alive. To just look at the different parts of it, okay, we have what's called the mesencephalon, which means middle of the brain, which is this area right here of the brain stem, okay, as well as this little spot right there. I'm going to come back to the tectum, the corpora quadrigemina. You can cross off tegumentum and cerebral peduncles, but we're going to look at the corpora quadrigemina in a different model. If we move down to the bottom of the brainstem, you have your medulla oblongata. Okay, this regulates your breathing. Okay, and then this is going to become your spinal cord. And then the bulgy part here is the pons. Okay, so if we just kind of tip it this way, you can see that the pons is kind of a big bulgy part. Here's the medulla oblongata. One of the other things you can kind of see here is you can see a number of the cranial nerves arising from the brainstem. That's what all these Roman numerals are. Okay, we're going to talk about cranial nerves separately. And then the cerebellum is what they call the little brain. So it's located back here, tucked underneath the cerebrum. Again, you're looking at a sagittal view of it here. It has a right and a left hemisphere as well. Okay, that's linked by a structure called the vermis, which means the worm. Instead of having gyri and sulci, it has folia, which are these little folds. Okay. Now, the important feature that you're going to see here is the arbor vitae. So that's this structure of white matter, kind of looks like a tree. Okay, and in fact, there is a shrub that's actually named an arborvitae. Okay, so that's the arbor vitae. Okay, don't worry about the cerebral peduncles. For me, I really like you to understand what the function of the cerebellum is. And the function of the cerebellum is that it fine-tunes your motor movements. Okay? So in other words, your motor command, it comes from your precentral gyrus in your cerebral cortex. And that command is going to go down a track, a descending tract, which is a motor neuron. But at the same time that that is happening, this part of your brain, cerebellum, is receiving information from your joints and your muscles via receptors that are called proprioceptors. Okay? And as your cerebellum receives that information, when your cerebral cortex issues a motor command, the cerebellum takes the information it's getting from proprioceptors, and what it does is it also sends a command, okay, down a descending tract, and that command merges with the command that comes from your cerebral cortex. And the commands that come from your cerebellum basically smooth out or fine-tune your motor movements. So just to demonstrate, if I decide I want to pick up that probe right there, the command to pick up the probe comes from my cerebral cortex. But as I'm moving my arm to pick up the probe, I'm getting commands from my cerebellum also to smooth out the movements so that I can pick up the probe. Okay? Otherwise, the movements might look something like this without that information from the cerebellum. Okay, so it fine-tunes our motor movements. Okay, now that covers everything on the sheet. However, I am going to make a separate video on the brain model. I'm going to take out the middle of this brain and show you a different view of everything and point out some other structures or revisit some of the structures we've already looked at. So make sure you watch that separate video that I'll be making on the inner part of the brain.